Welcome to Weaving the Blanket, the Iguayu, stories of faith, sacrifice, martyrdom, and the emancipation of the Evangelical Methodist Church in Bolivia. My name is David Stevenson. This is Season 4, The Making of the Saints of the IMB, and this is Episode 4, Benjo's Conversion. In the last episode, we heard of the Corsons meeting working with the known communist Benjamin Paredes, better known as Benjo, and his difficult early life as a poor orphan. And we just finished telling about the first encounter between these two very different men. One, an IEMB pastor from the United States, and the other, an indigenous communist who had been taught to hate North Americans and Christians, and the Corsons were both. In the previous episode, we just completed the story of Ken picking up Benjo from the, quote, shopping center, unquote, at the river and helping him back to SIFAT with his heavy bag of potatoes. And Sarah was telling us about Tom and Benjo's conversation during this first encounter between the two men in the truck. Once again, here is Sarah telling what Benjo said in public about that first encounter with the Corsons.
And he thought, this is our hope for our town. This guy can lead us. He will bypass us and go to the UN or some other place to get help. We've got to stick with him. And so he began to come over to our house every evening after work. No, he didn't come to church yet, but he began to come to ask Ken. And Ken realized he was the mayor, and he began to ask Ken questions. Every night he would come right after we'd finished eating, about time for us to go to bed. So right at the foot of our bed was where there was the two chairs. I couldn't go to sleep, and I didn't have a place to sit down either. And so every night I'd have to, because we could. And so they sat there with a candle on the desk talking, and he'd stay till midnight, and sometimes he'd even stay till 2 a.m.
When Benjo told me about this first encounter with the Corsons and those late night talks, he told me how he just knew the missionary was going to preach about how we're all sinners and we're bad people, and he would preach about going along with the system the way it was, and that they would get their reward after they died and went to heaven. And he was ready to verbally confront this purveyor of injustice, this Methodist pastor. But that isn't what Ken and Sarah said. Ken simply talked to him about the problems facing the community. Benjo, as leader of the community, was always open to new ideas, and Ken and Sarah had some great ideas on how to improve SIFAT. They even got into deep discussions about which philosophical religious approach could best help their community, Marxism or Christianity. There were long, deep, calm, respectful conversations, but they both agreed that there was much they could do to improve the life of the people of their community. Ultimately, of course, Ken demurred to Benjo, who was the community leader. It would usually end up with Ken saying, "How can I help you?" Benjo appreciated Ken and Sarah's ideas on how to improve the town and their willingness to help make things happen. And he made sure that Ken and Sarah attended the town meetings where decisions were made for the community. Here's Ken talking about that.
When Sarah and I and our family were living in SIFAT, we went to their town meetings. We were given both voice and vote, which was extraordinary. Well, I was. And the approach that we had was every meeting we would take a low-key type thing and only speak modestly, but the idea was to get them to start on the planning process without saying it that way. And one meeting I asked, what do you see your town being like in 2 years or 5 years? And as we've said before, for poor people who've done anything, so it took a little while for that idea to develop, but they started thinking on it. And it finally came to a session where they were going to vote on what they thought was the most important priority. And here we're looking at water, at sanitation, at education, at so many things. And so when they voted on it, the thing that they had as their highest priority was a soccer field. You know, in my mind, I'm saying how ridiculous of all of these other great needs and all that, but then I'd have to swallow my own words, making it their idea. It was probably one of the wisest things I've ever done, because once the soccer field was built, we had teams and essentially cheerleaders. And in Sapetro at that time, these were poor people, mostly from Altiplano, that had their own lotes, and they were living isolated from each other, and a lot of them didn't speak the same language. There was no community, and that's why community development is one of the basic we have followed.
With the soccer team came a growing sense of unity within the community. Soon opportunities came for other projects.
We started a brick project down there, but with the brick project, we were able to build a brick church. The way this happened was we were living next to the church in our bamboo parsonage, dirt floor and native in every sense. With our $80 salary, we were not able to go out and hire a lot of people to do a lot. And this 15, 16-year-old boy came by looking for a job. And he was the head of the family. His mother and father were dead, and he had a younger brother and sister. We saw immediately that here was a real need, but we didn't have money to help. But I wanted to encourage him, and I said, "What did you do where you came from?" And this, of course, was in Altiplano. He said, I worked with my father until he died. We made brick. And I asked the question, "You mean adobe sun-dried brick?" He said, "No, we made fired brick." Well, we had been starting a fish project, and we had some fairly large fish ponds. And when you dig dirt out, you don't have a place to put it. It's piled up. So I took him out. I showed him these piles of dirt, and I said, "Can you make brick out of this?" I didn't know how to make brick.
Yeah.
And he said, "Give me a few days." So he built a kiln and fired brick. And also, he built a little mold and used his thigh to make Spanish tiles. And so he made tiles for floors in an area where dirt was the only thing around. So as a result of this orphan boy who didn't know he knew anything that would make a difference, it started what we called the Brick Project. Benjo, who had learned how to write grant proposals, wrote to Habitat for Humanity. Well, Habitat doesn't usually go that far out. They'll go into the suburbs and all that.
Right.
The jungle is not really attractive to them, but the Brick Project piqued their interest. And this was in Benjo's handwriting. And so it was in Spanish, and it caught the attention of the Habitat people, and they came down. And when they came, they brought finance.
Yeah.
And so people who make $1 a day or whatever, they can still have a house if they put sweat equity into it. And so as a result of the Brick Project, it changed the architecture of the zone.
The community decided that one of the first brick homes to be built should be for the Corsons, and they gladly accepted the offer. As Ken and Benjo continued their nightly meetings, keeping poor Sarah awake late into the night, Sarah said that she noticed a change in the topics of conversation. Benjo gradually began to ask Ken about his faith. It was so odd for Benjo. Here was one of the oppressors, one of the enemies, the one he hated, was organizing and helping his community in so many ways. They often invited him to sit and eat at his table. He played with their children. At 37 years old, all that he had been taught, all that he believed, was now being challenged by this couple who did nothing except love him, love their community, and give their life to help his people. And they constantly talked to him about a loving God that only wants justice.
He was so hungry, he began to ask Ken why he came. And Ken said, because of Jesus, because God loves you all, and he put a love in our hearts to come down here and help. And then he began to ask about the Bible, and Ken began to show him where Jesus said I was hungry and you fed me, and those kind of things. And he said, I never knew those things were in the Bible. And he just kept listening and kept listening. And I said, Ken, I am so tired. We were in a struggle. Our day was just so packed full. And I just wanted to lie down so bad I didn't dare in front of the mayor of the town, I said, Ken, tell him to come in the daytime to talk to you. And Ken said, Saturday he has to work. This is the only time you can. And I said, I guess that's right. So I would just sit there and quietly pray in my mind for them while he was talking to Ken every night. And then, according to him, one night he was convinced that God was real. He was a sinner and he needed to be saved. And so he didn't tell Ken. He walked out our back door and he walked to the middle of the fish ponds. They were right together so you could walk through. And he walked out and he said, I looked up at the stars. It was a real starry night. And I looked down in the water and saw the stars reflected. There were stars everywhere. I just felt the presence of God. And I knew I was a sinner because I had hated Christians. And I fell on my knees in the middle of those fish ponds. And I asked God to forgive me and make me a Christian. And he said, I don't know how long I stayed there, but I stayed there a long time talking to God. And when I got up, he said, I was no longer carrying this heavy weight of hatred inside me. And when he told this, and people were crying all over the congregation, and then he just, with tears in his eyes, he just reached out his arms toward them and said, brothers, sisters, I don't hate you anymore. I love you. You are my brother. You are my sister. Because of Jesus, he took that hatred out of my heart. And the next day, we didn't know that was happening when it happened because we went to bed. It was after midnight. And the next day he came back and he said, Pastor, I'm really ready to work with you now. He had already been helping us on the fish ponds and all. He said, I'm ready to work with you now. He said, I've given my life to Jesus and I'm ready to work with you. Oh. So he began to from that time on.
So Benjo began to attend worship every week. The missionaries not only held worship services on Sunday, but during the week. Now the war began that he had always anticipated. Only it wasn't a war with guns and death. It was a spiritual war against injustice, hunger, and poverty. Now it was a war about love, not hatred, forgiveness, not revenge. With his training and skills, his innate leadership qualities, and now his newfound spiritual growth and strength, he became even more a leader of SIFAT, again fighting injustices and pushing for the rights of the indigenous people. And he wasn't alone. Throughout the Iglesia Evangelica Methodista in Bolivia, there was this spiritual battle going on ever since the Aymara Revolution within the IMB, in which the indigenous had wrestled control of the church away from the missionaries and the Hispanic elite. The IMB was in the center of the battle for human rights and justice for the indigenous people, often at the cost of imprisonment and even martyrdom. And Benjo, Ken, and Sarah fought the violence of poverty, hunger, and homelessness.
Of course, the Corsons were careful not to be bossy or push their ideas on the community. That's what foreigners usually do. They paternalistically believe that they know better about what the local community needs than the locals themselves. That's crazy if you think about it. And they didn't push their faith. They were careful not to tell them what to do or to push them to change their accepted ways. They did preach about what Jesus said, and they tried to live out what he said, and the people saw the difference. But they had to bite their tongue many times not to tell them what to do, but to just model what Jesus taught. And they had to decide for themselves that they would notice the way that they lived. There is one little story that's embarrassing for them to tell, but I think it's a wonderful story about the difference between modeling and why they didn't push. They tried to live on the same level with the same resources they had, except where it was unhealthy. They tried to identify and understand why they did what they did. They thought they had done fairly well at living like that. And then one day, before they were leaving to move back to Alabama, one of the local ladies visited, and during the conversation she said, quote, "We know you all are not like us," unquote. It broke their hearts. What had they done wrong? So Sarah said, "How are we not like you? We eat what you eat. We walk for transportation and have no vehicle just like you. I cook on an open fire like you. We bathe in the creek like you. How are we different?" "Oh," the woman responded, "I know you live like us that way, but I mean we get mad at each other, and we argue and try to get our own way, and we just love our friends and the ones who agree with us. But you all are different. You love everybody, even those who don't agree with you," unquote. So I was glad when she explained that, because we did try to be different in that way. And they noticed everything we did, and we didn't have to tell them how they should live. I believe God shows us how to be happy by giving us the Bible and the teachings of Jesus. But He doesn't push us. He waits for us to make our own decisions, and He suffers with us when we choose wrongly. But He doesn't try to force us to change. And the communities taught us what worked. We learned from them, and they would see us frequently implement their technology and use it. But we would sometimes suggest a different technology that might work better, and the community either agreed to try it or not. If the answer was no, we dropped it. And we developed some new, truly appropriate technologies which weren't dependent upon outside resources, and that would often lead to a request to learn more about it, and sometimes of others in the community asking for our help in implementing the new technology. But it was important that any technology the community implemented, it would not be dependent upon outside resources. It had to only use local resources available to the community. At one town meeting, there was a big discussion about why the children in the community were dying. After some discussions, they asked Ken what he thought was causing it. Ken answered that one reason is the lack of protein. They asked, "What is protein?" And Ken gave them examples: meat, cheese, eggs, beans, fish, poultry. They thought about it and discussed it all week. And the next week they asked him, "Could we start a fish project and grow fish for protein?" And Ken assured them that they could. And they asked him, "If we start a fish project, would you direct it and show us how?" "Well, yes, that'd be great." That was the minute that Ken had waited for. He had studied the fish culture the summer before he went to Bolivia, and just so he could be ready if that were appropriate. We never suggested that they do something unless they asked about doing it. We gave them information which made them think about it, and then, if they asked for help, we would do it. But it was their project, not ours. If we had pushed it earlier when we saw they needed it, they might have agreed, but then they might have been resentful that they had to help work on, quote, Ken's project, unquote, even though they knew it was for their benefit. But Ken waited, and these questions they asked were over a period of several weeks. They would then talk among themselves about the idea, and then when they decided, it was because it was their idea and they voted to have the fish project. That meant that they organized themselves and elected one man to keep records of who worked. They taxed themselves 1 day a month of labor for each family, usually the father or older sons. Then they donated food that they had grown, and the women took turns helping me cook a big pot of soup or whatever we had on hand, like cooking bananas, so that everyone who worked had lunch served to them. We didn't even know how many hours anyone worked, but they knew. Their elected secretary kept records, and if one family didn't send a worker that month, they would go see them and tell them that the ponds were to breed fish for everyone, and they were in debt a day's work. It worked smoothly. Even a widow with a house full of children came and worked one day. The community told her she didn't have to work, but she said, "I want to be a part of this project. It will make our children healthier." Ken got the engineer who bulldozed the roads and had the only tractor in the area to scoop out 4 big holes about 40 feet by 80 feet to get the breeding pond started. And then it took us from February until May to finish them by hand. Every household in the community helped equally. It wasn't a fish farm to produce food for the people. It produced fingerlings for the people to get their own mini fish farms started. But that's another story, not for this podcast. But Sarah didn't want to give you the wrong impression that Ken started the fish project, as that would be bad development. Ken gave them the idea when they asked questions about why their children were dying, and they were eating rice, mainly 3 times a day. This is one of the big principles that we have worked for and we teach today. Don't answer a question that they have not asked, but live so they see a difference, and they begin to ask questions that you are wanting to answer. And another principle we had was to use the resources at hand as much as possible. Of course, that doesn't mean we can never bring in anything else. It means that what we bring in needs to be sustainable so they can continue to use it after we are gone. If it had to be replaced or replenished in a year or two, then it would require the funds or transportation to bring in fish tanks for the others. So the project would fail within 20 years or so at the least, and not be enough to help the population as it would grow. The key word we use in what we bring in is it must be sustainable long term.
SIFAT has now published Benjo's life story in a book. He wrote this book in the little house in the jungle near SIFAT. He sent it to La Paz for a SIFAT worker there to type it into the computer and then send it on up to the Corsons by computer.